dearios, it's David McGee here with another edition of Little Did You Know. It's a chat show in which I talk to people I find interesting. I hope you agree. Now, today's episode could be a drinking game. I've got my shot glass here. So every time my guest drops the name of a famous celebrity, have a drink. You'll be paralytic by the end of the show. That's why we've got him.
You wicked man.
He's just appeared and said that I'm wicked, which is absolutely true. He's a Hollywood insider, and he's my kind of man. These are some of the things he said about himself. I have no shame. I never say no, and I'm up for anything. He's a natural for this show. I knew him decades ago. He was in London in the 1970s, but today he's coming to us from his home in Los Angeles. Will you please say hello to the very wonderful David del Valle?
Welcome, David McGilvery, correct?
That's near enough.
Is it? I'm terrible with last names, but I never forget your first name. And how could I? We both have the same one.
We're common as muck because we're David. David, are you coming to us also from the heart of Hollywood?
The heart of Hollywood, the city that has no heart. I think that Richard Lamparski used to say that. That was his way of autographing books. From the heart of Hollywood, the city that has no heart. Although I do believe every city has a heart. One just has to find it. And those of us in the horror community, which I imagine it's you and me across the pond, it's kind of a small town, really.
Well, you've interviewed an enormous amount of people. You've also done upwards of 65 audio commentaries for DVDs and Blu-rays. How do you describe yourself?
A total hooker. How's that for? I think that I started out, as we all did, being enraptured by movies, not just genre movies, but just the sheer idea of being alone in a room with a film, which I did when I was a child, watching shock theater. And that's how I came to know the Universal movies that we all became so fond of, Dracula and the Wolfman and all of that. And I think it kind of opened the door for imagination. And it wasn't until I started reading Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine in the very late 50s, early 60s as a child that I realized there were other people out there that had the same tastes as I did. And so that was kind of a jolly thing to understand. So that's how I became a fan, I believe.
So, okay, we're going to describe you as a film fan. I think that's near enough. Now, your birth date is not listed everywhere, but
If I wish it weren't, I can tell you that.
I'm going to guess, correct me if I'm wrong, it's 1949 in Texas.
That's correct.
Mm.
That's correct.
Gotcha.
And I wish to God I had known, and when I was getting on the IMDb, I could have just put my month and day, and buggered putting the date, and then I wouldn't be sitting here telling you that I'm going to be 72 years old on Friday.
Well, happy birthday in advance of that. You're not that far behind me, David. Now, you studied at San Francisco State University. You've spent most of your time on the west coast of America, but there were two trips to other cities. Now, you tell me which came first, London or New York?
Oh, New York. Actually, I was going to New York when I was a small kid with my parents to see Broadway shows. But when I moved to New York, it was all around the late 70s, and I want to emphasize 1983, because 1983 was the beginning of the AIDS crisis. And I was going between New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles, the three major cities that were being hit with this, because there was the Village in New York, the Castro in San Francisco, and West Hollywood. And so these were the three cities that I was kind of traveling between. And I have a book coming out next year, which tentatively I'm calling The Glitter Stops at La Brea, which is about living through the AIDS crisis in those three cities, San Francisco, New York, and LA, which just happened to be the way my life was going at that time. And there aren't many of us that survived that. And that's why I felt it was important that I write about it, which is going to be a little bit of a different book than my film books, because usually I write about my experiences in Hollywood or film history, which of course my film history is thinly veiled memoir because,
I'm glad you're recording that, David. Something tells me that while you were in New York, however, you were trying acting. What does that mean?
Well, it means that when you arrive in New York, the first thing you see on television is A Star is Born with Judy Garland. This indicates to you that all the cosmos is in your favor and acting is going to be what you want to do. Then you go through from the euphoria of that, you go into the crisis of realizing everyone that waits on you in restaurants is a wannabe actor. There are actors everywhere. When you come to Los Angeles, it's almost better not to be an actor, just to set yourself apart from the crowd. And I quickly realized that I would have a much better time of it if I got on the other side of the camera. So when I came to Los Angeles, I became a theatrical agent. But when I was in New York, I actually did, pound the pavements and do auditions. And it was, I wouldn't trade any of it because it was all great fun and great experiences.
Did you train as an actor?
Oh yes, I went. I always did plays. Even when I was in college, I thought I should major in theater, but thinking in terms of making a living, I thought, well, I better get a degree in something that's a little more commercial, like being an English teacher. I really got a degree so I could teach high school. And as far as I got, when I first moved to Los Angeles, I was a substitute teacher. So I would just go in, and I really wasn't teaching anyone anything because you're kind of a glorified babysitter. You go into someone's class and you take it over for the 2 or 3 days that they're ill. And most of the time you really don't pick up their classes. You know what I'm saying? So in any case, that was kind of, it wasn't as much of a thrill as I thought it was going to be. But then, who knew I was going to turn into a film historian?
Well, in fact, I can reveal that you did return to acting, and we are going to talk about that uh, later. We're going to talk about everything.
Oh my God. Well, you can't prove a thing, is all I'm saying.
Tell us now, why did you come to London?
Well, I came to London because my friend John Cobal, who lived in both London and New York, he lived in Drayton Court in London and he lived right near the Village in New York. And I became kind of his assistant when he was beginning to move his enormous collection of memorabilia from his home to what became the Cobal collection, which I'm happy to say is still functioning today. And that was when I really became aware of what my vocation was going to be, because John proved to be a real mentor. His best friend was John Russell Taylor, who was then editing Films and Filming magazine, which of course had been edited earlier by Robin Bean. And when John took it over, of course, it was quite different in format. It was different in content. Robbie kind of had what was a closeted, not very closeted, gay film magazine. Everyone knew it was gay. No one ever said it was gay. Across the pond, there was After Dark magazine that was also gay, but never once said it was gay. So those were going on at the same time.
Well, you're answering all my questions before I ask them. You must have been aware of Films and Filming when you were first in London, later, as you say. When after the magazine had been cleaned up, you wrote for it, and
There
here.
it is. Yes, that's actually my dateline. Oh my God, I haven't seen that in.
So this is your column. Let's get the light out of it. It's called Dateline Hollywood. And there is the byline, David del Valle.
There
Now,
you go.
when you were in London, David, I think you fell in with a friend of mine. He was a writer for films and filming as well. He later made a horror film called Mark of the Devil. It's Michael Armstrong. He's
Michael Armstrong, yes, my dear friend Michael, and I hope you give him my love if and when you see him. I know you don't see him as often as you'd like. He was a great mate. He is a great guy, very fine writer, absolutely crazy, totally self-indulgent, his own worst enemy. Aside from all that, lots of love to Mike.
when you got here. How did you meet up with him?
Well, I met up with Mike in Hollywood. I never really dealt with Michael in London. Michael was in Hollywood uh, when Jenny Craven was still working at Cannon Films. In fact, it was Cannon that kind of connected us. But how I actually met Michael was I lived in Beverly Hills, right across from Chasen's restaurant. And there was a market, an all-night market called Hughes across the street. Now, my good friend Reggie Nalder, the actor, who of course was one of the stars of Mark of the Devil, lived about 2 blocks from me. And Reggie was shopping at Ralph's one day or Hughes one day and said, I saw that Michael Armstrong in the frozen foods at Michael Armstrong's here. May I bring him over? So Mike came over to my apartment and he was living across the street at the time. And so Reggie Nalder was really the catalyst for me meeting Michael. And but loads of stories with that, of course.
Well, we're jumping around like grasshoppers, as I expected we might do, David. I'm determined, though, just to tie up a few loose.
Absolutely. Tie away.
You mentioned films and filming, which was notorious in the days of the first editor, Robin Bean, and there was a lot of male nudity in it. There was also, I was writing for this magazine at the time. There was also a notorious personal column, which occasionally attracted the interest of the Metropolitan Police. Were you aware of that, David?
No, I wasn't, but it certainly stands to reason. And I think of a particular young man named John Hamill, who was a an actor and model or escort, as we like to say in Hollywood. And he must have run ads in all those places at one time for artists, models, and things, because this was still in the period of time when you couldn't be that open with things. But I'll tell you something about Robin Bean that Mike was we were both kind of comparing notes. You know, when you would go visit Robbie, he would give you orange juice that was laced with LSD. That and you would walk out of his apartment going into it was unbelievable the stuff that guy did.
Why is this not a surprise? So anyway, that was London, and we've dealt with New York as well. We're going to talk about some of your other New York stories later, but probably only for Patreon subscribers because they can't touch us there. Um,
Absolutely.
Now, you've mentioned Reggie Nalder, and I need to talk to you more about him now because when you came back to Los Angeles, you became an agent, and we can now reveal that, in fact, now Reggie was one of your clients. He was
Yes, he was, along with Barbara Steele and Hermione Baddeley and Natalie Schaefer. I specialized in character actors because I love them so much. But I did have the odd likely lad in the agency too. So
well.
needless to say, I was definitely dealing with the wrong people, as Robin Mom would say.
A nice link there, David, to something of mine that may come up later. Reggie used to be a regular subject of letters that was sent to me at Films and Filming, and people wanted to know why he looked the way he did. Now, can you reveal anything more about this?
Well, I can tell you that Reggie had two stories that he would alternate as to what happened to under his chin, which is burnt. The great story is that in his early life, he was what they called an Apache dancer. Do you know what an Apache dancer is? You know, they kind of take the woman, da, 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 bumpa, 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 bump, throw them on. It's kind of like an S&M thing. And Reggie had a partner who was a woman, young, impressionable, and very much in love with him. And he was very handsome when he was young, and and of course he was gay, but at this point he probably was closeted about it, like Anton Diffring was for 5 minutes. And so Reggie played around, and this woman got very jealous, and at one point in their very tempestuous relationship, she tossed acid into his face, burning his under his chin. That's story number one. When I started to interview him for Tim Lucas's Video Watchdog, I asked him again. And this time he said, I had a case of acne when I was in my teens, and this was the result of a sun lamp that I was using to help my skin that burnt my. So I prefer the more romantic acid tossed in his face by a disgruntled lover rather than a sun lamp from an acne treatment. So those are the two stories.
Me too. Thank you for bringing us up to date on those. Well, Reginalda, of course, became famous in horror films. Mark of the Devil was one of them, but he was best known as the vampire in Salem's Lot. Now, have you seen his appearance in a hardcore porn film called Dracula Sucks?
Oh, sure. That was shot in Palmdale, and I was there. In fact, John Holmes, Reggie described his cock as saying, yeah, it was like a snake in repose. And he said, I could get no sleep in Palmdale because the motel doors were banging back and forth all night as people exited and entered different rooms. And I said, well, I suppose that snake wasn't always in repose then. And that was where we left it with that. But Reggie was really famous for being in Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much, more than Salem's Lot. Of course, now everyone knows him from that. But
Well, we're going to return now to something I promised we would return to earlier, and this is your occasional appearances in films. Now, when people ring you up, what do they want of you? What sort of parts do you specialize in?
well, I specialize in parts where hopefully I'll have a line or two, because cameos can be a bit perplexing unless you're stupendously famous and just the shot of you gives people that adrenaline rush. In my case, it's a bit different. So, one of the first movies I got a small part, and I was still in college, is a movie called Messiah of Evil, which starred my friend Michael Greer, who was a female impersonator and a very, very funny dear man who we lost far too early. And but now that I'm in Hollywood, I've been in a number of Charles Band. I was in a Puppet Master movie and a couple of what we call evil bong movies. A total, I'm shameless. I will appear in, I will even do Trouser Bar Part 2 when you come around to it, David.
I'm writing your name down
You
on.
must, with or without corduroy.
We'll look forward to seeing you in that film and many others. David, would you like to play a lead?
Well, yes, I certainly believe I have a little bit of the Lionel Atwill quality in me, a touch of George Zuko with maybe a soupçon of Eric Portman, who I've always admired.
So, any casting directors watching this, David is available. But you're also a writer, David. You've written a column called Camp David for Films in Review, a very old magazine now, just online. And
It's the oldest, I believe. I've been writing for them for 20 years, David. Can you imagine?
what you do is you just tell us stories about your adventures in Hollywood.
Well, yes. I mean, I have a new one coming out from Bear Manor. I know I shouldn't say this because Ben Omart's been avid. I have two books at Bear Manor: Lost Horizons Beneath the Hollywood Sign and Six Reels Under, which I know is an awkward title. But my cousin, Robert Del Valle, was the associate producer of 6 Feet Under. the very popular, and he also worked on Glee as a producer. So I wanted to give Robert a bit of a heads up, so I just retitled it Six Reels Under, but instead of 6 feet under. But I have a third one, which is going to be called Del Valle of the Dolls, which will continue my intrepid adventures in Tinseltown, uh, including the night that I abandoned Zelda Rubinstein because she made me angry. And I left her at a venue. And while I mean, I know this makes me look really bad, but it's actually, I think it's understandable when I explain what happened. But in any case, those are among the stories. There are always people that are a little off the radar, but still recognizable.
They're the people you like, yes. Now, you were encouraged, nay, inspired, I think, to write these books by a friend of yours, best known now as the author of Hollywood Babylon.
Kenneth Anger, yes. Kenneth Anger. I've been very fortunate, David, in my life that my mentors have all been people that were extraordinary in just every way. John Cobal, John Russell Taylor, Kenneth Anger, Carlos Clarence, William K. Everson. Bill Everson took me into his apartment and showed me these movies that I would never have seen otherwise. Movies that now I'm doing audio commentary for, these pre-code movies from Paramount. He showed me The Great Impersonation. I'd never heard of these movies. He showed me The Black Camel with Lugosi and Warner Oland at times when these movies weren't on television, they weren't on, and I didn't even know what they were. And he opened the doors for me and so did Carlos Clarence. Carlos wrote the first book on the horror film that was widely accepted as being almost definitive. And he was a great, great man to know. Very funny, very charming.
We're going to talk a lot more about films in the second half of the show, and we're going to talk about your relatives as well. You've mentioned one of them already. But now we're going to take a break and have a look at a trailer for a Peccadillo release, and it's one of the strangest films that Peccadillo ever put out. It's called The Samurai, and it's about a policeman obsessed with a creature of the night who takes the form of a man in drag. Have a look at this and then join us again in a couple of minutes.
Der Schlachter hat angerufen.
Wieso?
Gefragt, wozu du das ganze Fleisch brauchst.
Wolski, hallo?
Hörst du das?
Was denn?
Das Geräusch.
Hallo? Na, Herr Kommissar, sind die Straßen sicher?
Warum hast du den Wolf gefüttert? Bist du bereit?
Wofür?
Für die Taufe.
Ich glaube, er ist tot.
Er versucht uns zu täuschen.
I'm David McGillivray. I'm here with my guest, David del Valle, and you've just seen a trailer for a Peccadillo release called The Samurai. It's available on peccadillopod.com, and it's also on this DVD as well. Alan Jones of Fright Fest says it's a masterpiece. He should know. I would call it unclassifiable. David, have you ever heard of this film?
No. And last night I went to a drive-in and saw Prisoners of Ghostland with Nicolas Cage, which had martial arts and everything you can think of thrown into it. It's an extraordinarily fucked up movie. And yeah, it seems to be there are more of those coming out now than I can imagine.
Yes, and I can imagine why as well. Now, you've brought up the subject of drive-ins there. We never really had them in this country, but I'm told, correct me if I'm wrong, that drive-ins are coming back because, is this true? They're a relatively safe space during the pandemic.
They are, and I will tell you a Michael Armstrong drive-in story. When Michael was here in the 80s, and I think it was 1985, he had never been to a drive-in, just like you. And so I said, well, we're going to go see Return of the Living Dead and Fright Night at the drive-in. So I take Mike to the drive-in, and we're there. And he goes, well, I can't watch this through this windshield. I'm going to roll down the window and stick my head out of the car. And I said, Mike, you can't watch the whole movie with your head sticking out of the car. So you know what he did? He said, well, the movie hasn't started yet. So he went down to where the swings were and played in the swings and the playland until it was time. You know, he's really a child. But in any case, he did finally sit down, and the movie, you know, and if the way they were now, you used to have a little box that was put in your car for the sound, a little speaker. And now it came through the radio. But yeah, I took Mike to the first drive-in, but they are coming back. I went to the Tiki, to Mission Tiki last night to see a double bill of Prisoner of Ghostland with Nicolas Cage, which was bizarre, and Malevolent, which was hideous. Should have been called Hideous.
What a double bill. I miss those. Now, David, you mentioned briefly in part one of the show one of your famous relatives. It's Robert Del Valle, who produced 6 Feet Under and Glee. There's more as well. Wasn't your mother a bit player?
My mother had played in films and had understudied twins that were Lynn and Lee Wilde, the Wilde sisters, and they made a movie called Andy Hardy's Blonde Trouble, and my mother was in that. And she tested back in the mid 40s, before I was born, to play Jean Harlow, and they platinumed my mother's hair. And she didn't get the job, of course, because they never made the movie, but she kept the hair. So my mother had platinum hair. So my mother would come to school, she always looked like a movie star. But my cousin, Jaime Del Valle, produced the lineup that Don Siegel made a film out of. And then I just did the commentary for it for Arrow there in the UK.
So it was inevitable you were going to get into movies. And I believe it was your mum as well who used to take you to, did she take you to horror films? Is this how you...
Took me to the very first horror movie I ever saw when I was 4 years old, which was House of Wax with Vincent Price. And I fell in love with Vincent Price. I fell in love with him before I really knew what it was that I was feeling towards this man, whom I never thought I would ever meet, David. And then to show you how life is, when I was in high school, Vincent came to Sacramento doing a lecture tour called Dear Theo, reading the letters of Vincent van Gogh to his brother Theo. And I went backstage, and believe it or not, Vincent Price and I remained friends from that moment until he died.
Now, this brings us very neatly onto Vincent Price. We're going to spend the rest of the show talking about your TV series and documentaries. You did a show called Sinister Image, and probably the most important guest you had on was Vincent Price. What did you talk about?
Well, I made a promise to Vincent. I said, if you will do my show, I will make sure that if anyone in the future asks you about your horror output, your horror films, you can just hand them this cassette, because what I want to do is talk about that in your life, because he had done so much. His career was so rich: Broadway, radio, movies, cabaret, dinner theater, books, cooking shows. He's done it all. He was a true Renaissance man. So, and he charged $40,000 a day to make, you know, he gave me all this, David, because he said, you belong in television. I want to help you. And that man came down to the studio free of charge spent the entire day with me and allowed me to have that opportunity. And I had sold it to Arts and Entertainment, not realizing, because I was such a novice, that I had no rights to the trailers, to the clips. And I had run up about $60,000 worth of movie clips I couldn't pay for. So we didn't get on A&E. And the long and the short of it is I put this show out myself. And then I think it was All Day Entertainment picked it up and put it out on home video. That was David Kalat, if you know who he is.
Well, Vincent Price was my favorite movie star, and so it's just such a delight to see him talking to you. Just tell me in a couple of words, what was he like?
He was probably the most generous and loving person you'll ever meet in your life. He truly wanted everyone to love him, which is what actors want. But he was just an incredibly generous person. When you were in his company, I would be with him when he would let his meal go cold, talking to people, signing autographs. He had more. He was like Joan Crawford. His fans were his lifeblood.
Another guest you had on Sinister Image was, believe it or not, another writer for films and filming, a friend of mine called Mike Sarn. Now, in this country, he was an actor and he did review films for films and filming, but in Hollywood, he was a director and he made one disastrous movie. Did he discuss that with you, David?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. We discussed Myra Breckenridge. We also discussed with Robin Bean The Road to Saint-Tropez, which introduced Udo Kier, who's now almost getting an Oscar, I think, for this gay film he's done, where he's playing a hairdresser who's outlived his gayness. Or I haven't seen this movie, but knowing Udo, I'm sure it's great. But yes, Mike did this Road to Saint-Tropez. He was a close friend of Brigitte Bardot, and he had been a rabbi at one time or another and a pop singer. I found Mike extremely engaging and fun, but I could certainly see why his career kind of went the way it did, because, you know, he was just one of those crazy guys.
Just tell us briefly, what went wrong with Myra Breckenridge?
Well, what went right with it was, look, Gore Vidal sold his script to 20th Century Fox with stipulations. And at first they were going to go with a female impersonator. In fact, Films and Filming has a very famous cover of a drag queen auditioning for Myra Breckenridge. They auditioned everybody until they decided to go with Raquel and Rex Reed, which of course was another kind. The movie today, because of the use of the very clever use of film clips, is a very entertaining movie, but it's certainly not Gore Vidal's book by a long shot.
To put it mildly, I've just received a message from my glamorous assistant who tells me that that film you just mentioned with Udo Kier is called Swan Song and it's going to be released by Peccadillo. How about that?
Whoa, that is synchronicity.
Isn't it a coincidence? I love them. Now, we're going to move on to a documentary you appeared in, which I absolutely loved because it was about a man I think we're both huge admirers of, and that was William Castle. He was one of the many people I think who were known as the Abominable Showman, and he loved stunts to publicize his horror films. Now, did you ever see a William Castle film either with a tingling seat or a dangling skeleton?
Both. I saw Emergo, Percepto, but you know, Bill Castle also produced and directed a lot of those crime doctor Whistler movies at Columbia. And he lent his yacht for Orson Welles to shoot The Lady from Shanghai. But he was what Vincent said, I was on a plane going to Florida and I read this article called Whatever Happened to Showbiz? And it was all about Bill Castle. And, you know, Bill Castle made Vincent a millionaire because he took a percentage of House on Haunted Hill instead of a salary and did very, very well.
Well, I once saw the Tingler in New York, and it was revived. And I deliberately, before the show, looked at the seats because not all of them had tingling mechanisms. It was a box underneath the seat, and I chose one with one of those boxes.
Ooh, you got a big thrill. Well, you know, the Tingler's great because Vincent Price always has a wife. If she's not dead, she's certainly not into him. I think Rob White knew what was up because in the Tingler, his wife comes home late and he's got a cat in his hand. And he said, "Oh, I thought you two may have met in the same alley." And then he pulls a gun on her because he's doing his experiments in fear. And he says, "My dear, this gun can put a hole in you the size of a medium grapefruit." And I mean, he was so camp in those movies.
Indeed. There's a wonderful preview of The Tingler, one of those films you must see before you die. We're going to have to move on to Electric Boogaloo, which I just think is scintillating. It's about a couple of hucksters called Golan and Globus, and you are thanked in the credits. Not only do you appear in the film, you are thanked. The filmmakers give you their deepest appreciation. Why is that, David?
Well, because I love Mark Hartley. Mark Hartley and I met because he produced and directed Electric Boogaloo, as well as the remake of Patrick with Charles Dance. And we just became great friends. And, you know, when he first started questioning me, I think what he was going for, he wanted someone to say negative things about Menachem. And I just didn't do that. And I said, look, Menachem was the kind of man that loved movies. He lived and breathed movies. And I could go into his office whenever I wanted. And Mike and I were just reading scripts at $35 a piece. We weren't any movers or shakers in that company. And he was just I liked him. You know, I thought he was, I liked him a lot. And I felt that those movies that Cannon made, over 400 of them, you know, there are a few classics in there. Runaway Train's a great movie.
Yep. You're talking.
In fact, I did the commentary for it with Eric Roberts.
Of course. You're talking about, yes, Menachem Golan, and he did indeed churn out films, and that documentary is just wonderful. I want to move on finally, David, to alas, we can't talk about everything, but I'm going to continue on Patreon. I want to talk about Haunted Hollywood. Now, this is a series you did last year. It's a series of films introduced by you, and you tell us stories about people in the films. And the tagline is Strange Stories of Tinseltown's Greatest Stars. Now, the film I'm going to pick out for you, David, is The Flesh Eaters. It's a very little known horror film, but I wrote about it.
Oh my goodness.
In this magazine.
Oh my goodness. Yes, I've had that issue. I've written for Shivers too. Ingrid Pitt and I had a big row in that. And it was back and forth. She wrote letters, I wrote letters. It's terrible.
Only we could talk about that. However, Shivers had this article about the Flesh Eaters, and I was writing about its star, Martin Kosleck. Something tells me that your story on Haunted Hollywood was about Herr Kosleck.
It was indeed, and I just wrapped up a commentary on The Mad Doctor with Basil Rathbone and Ellen Drew and Vera Vague. Now there's your drag name, Vera Vague. I mean, why she changed it. If I were Vera Vague, I'd remain vague forever. But no, I knew Martin Kosleck. I met him through a young man named Tony Clay, who was a stunt man at Universal for the A-Team ride. And he was a big film buff. And his two guys that he got to know in Hollywood were John Abbott and Martin Kosleck. Both guys happened to be gay. Both guys happened to be rather snobbish, especially John. But Martin was rather alcoholic. And so when he would drink, he would immediately go into his stories. Now, The Flesh Eaters is interesting because Chris Drake, who was a very handsome blonde hunk, was Martin's boyfriend. And he was so good looking that the people that were making the film, The Flesh Eaters, wanted Chris to play the lead. But unfortunately, he wouldn't stop drinking and they just gave up on him. but he did have a small role as the captain of the little ship. But Martin was an amazing character. He married, in name only, a woman who helped sponsor him in Europe. And he was a very fine portrait painter. He was a close friend of Bette Davis. He painted Bette Davis. Albert Einstein wrote the notes for his art opening in New York. Martin Kosleck was an amazing character. But he was very handsome when he was young, but he was very perverse too in his appearance and the way he acted.
Well, when this article came out, we had a feeling Christopher Drake might still be alive. So we were very discreet in our references to Martin Kosleck's companion. That's all we were allowed to say.
Lord, well, those days are gone, my friend, and now we can call a spade, as they say.
Indeed, we can. Now, I must just find out, just before we wrap up, about something about your next project. It fascinates me. It's called Boulevard, and it's directed by Jeffrey Schwartz, who's done marvelous documentaries about Divine and Tab Hunter. I'm sure you knew them both, David, but tell us, what is Boulevard and what do you do in it?
Boulevard is the story of a previous attempt by Gloria Swanson to do a musical version of Sunset Boulevard. For this endeavor, instead of going to established writers, established composers, she chose two young men, one of whom was an actor named Richard Weiler. Richard Weiler was in Little Women, The Strange Door, The Three Musketeers with Lana Turner at MGM. Then he changed his name to Richard Stapley and appeared in a number of Eurotrash westerns and movies like The Million Eyes of Sumaru with Shirley Eaton. He made a couple of those movies for Harry Allen Towers, and all of that. And so he was my next door neighbor when I lived in Hollywood back in 2000. And I got him to sit down with me and record a commentary, or at least half of a commentary, for The Strange Door with Boris Karloff and Charles Laughton. But like most actors, especially self-indulgent actors or actors that are total narcissists and self-involved, he really couldn't remember much of what was going on around him, as a lot of actors do when they're making movies. They can't really, they don't really remember a lot,
I want to see a Boulevard. I sincerely hope I will very soon.
Well, it's out. In fact, you can watch it online now.
Oh, absolutely splendid. Personally, I don't know why it wasn't included in the London Film Festival, which
it was at Outfest. It was at Outfest at the Directors Guild.
Well, by the time this program goes out, London Film Festival will be running here in London. David, at this point in the show, I normally talk about my guest next week. I'm going to do it right now because it just shows you how much planning goes into these programs. My guest next week is somebody I think you may be aware of. It's a friend of mine called Peter Fuller. He's got a book coming out called Supper with the Stars. What's it about? Vincent Price's culinary adventures.
Oh, well, Peter Fuller is the heart and soul of the Vincent Price fan club, or the Vincent Price appreciation group. He's the Victoria Price goes over there and he coordinates things. Originally, I think I met Peter. He came to Hollywood, and I think I ran into him on Hollywood Boulevard.
I thought you...
Not that if you come to Hollywood Boulevard, I'm the first person you run into, but, depends.
Victoria Price, you just mentioned her, Vincent's daughter, and she has written the foreword to this book. That's next week.
Give him my love when you see him.
I shall indeed. We're recording that next week. I'm getting confused with timelines here, but you know what I mean. We're doing the recording next week. We have to end it there, but David, will you hang around, because I've got a lot more probing questions for you, but just...
I am here to be probed.
How marvelous that will be on Patreon. Patreon subscribers, you can join us right now. We'll be waiting for you. If you're not a subscriber, this is where the link comes up. There it is. It's so easy to become one of us. David, thank you so much for being with us all the way from Los Angeles.
Well, it was my pleasure.
And mine too. Join me again next week for Peter Fuller. Until then, this is David McGillivray saying, mwah. Bye.